Welcome back, KOAP Euro Nation, if such a thing exists, to today's SIGcast on the Age of Exploration. This SIGcast is congruent to Key Concept 1.3 on the newer AP European College Board curriculum, and is also congruent with Key Concept 1.4 on the pre-2017 curriculum. Now a word from our sponsors. Do you need shrubs, mulch, trees, flowers? Each make a great gift that lasts way longer than the coffee mug or chocolate apple you bought Mr. Sig for Teacher Appreciation Day. By the way, I really do appreciate the thought. My kids love the chocolate apple, and I do use the coffee mug daily. But Signature Gardens invites you to have your own Age of Exploration in Export, PA. Get it? Your own Age of Exploration? Classic. In our gardens, where you can see plants in a natural setting or natural habitat, rather than on shelves and pallets, like at the Big Orange hardware store. Please visit signaturegardens.com for more details. So in part one today, we're going to look at our key objective, and that is to really have a grasp and have a lot of examples of what exactly caused the Age of Exploration and Discovery. Key Concept 1.4 is Europeans explored and settled overseas territories, encountering and interacting with indigenous populations. European nations were driven by commercial and religious motives to explore overseas territories and establish colonies. European states sought direct access to gold and spices and luxury goods as a means to enhance personal wealth and state power that had been developing for centralized monarchies. Now, this interest in new direct paths or trade routes to seek access to gold and spices and luxurious goods really dates back to information brought home by the Christian Crusaders in the 11th and 14th centuries. And it really creates a European interest in Asian markets and even Middle Eastern markets. Likewise, the rise of the nation states that we've been referring to as centralized states or new monarchies also results in competition for access to these empires and these trade routes. Likewise, Marco Polo's travels in the late 13th century eastward, where he hung out with Kublai Khan, was very, very influential on a lot of people in the 1400s and the 1500s. An example of that would be that Columbus kept a copy of Marco Polo's book, Travels, on his famous trip to the New World. And also, in 1453, we've already noted that the Ottoman Turks had sacked Constantinople. They also, at the expense of the Mongols, broke up the Mongol Empire and really reduced the West's capacity and ability to freely trade as much as they could with the East. So a lot of this created, this obstacle created a lot of people looking for different routes, different ways to bypass the Ottomans and to get access to those Asian markets. Other examples of European states and why they wanted to seek direct access to gold, spices, and luxurious items, and they're driven by their commercial and religious motives. Renaissance materialism in general had expanded demand for silks and other treasures from the East. We've talked about how the new rich, the new wealth, the bourgeoisie, if you will, whether it's talking about Castiglione's Book of Cordier, but they wanted to dress the part. They wanted to outdo the nobility. So there's this materialistic aspect of Renaissance society that, you have to keep up with the Joneses. You have to have the latest and the best, which is kind of a Western phenomenon if you think about it. But the problem came into Europe that they had to rely on the Arab intermediaries or Arab middlemen. Some people call them comendas. In order to trade with and get access to the silks and spices and the sweet stuff from the East, you had to rely on middlemen. And a lot of these people did business with the Italians. Well, many nations sought to eliminate these middlemen altogether. And a lot of people, a lot of wealthy people, a lot of monarchs started to recognize the potential profit if they could actually find a quicker route to bypass these middlemen. Portugal and Spain desired to break the Italian middlemen as well. They didn't like having to deal with not only the Arab middlemen, but the Italian merchants that had a monopoly on the trade and access to those middlemen. So the new monarchs really sought the idea of, hey, if we can eliminate Italy altogether, we could really make a killing, and obviously that paid off for Spain. So European explorers, adventurers also individually, whether it's conquistadors or the explorers themselves, hoped to find gold and other precious metals. One Spanish conquistador summed up his purpose on earth: serve God and His Majesty, to give light to those who are in darkness, and to grow rich, as all men desire to do. And that kind of sums up what I'm going to introduce here to you, the concept of the 3 G's: God, glory, and gold, as being a factor of interest in dealing and trading with the Eastern markets. Now, another thing that happened here as European nations were driven by commercial and religious motives was that there was this rise in a new economic order in the 17th century that became known as mercantilism. Laws of mercantilism are relatively complex and complicated, but really can be broken down into 2 main components. Law number 1 is fixed wealth, and then law number 2, national accumulation of wealth, is crucial for the mother country. So let me explain. Law number 1, fixed economic wealth. So Europeans in the early modern era believed that there was only a certain or fixed amount of money and resources in the world. And because of this, the goal for each country was to compete with one another to accumulate as much of the wealth that they could, or as many slices of the fixed pie as they possibly could for themselves, which leads us to Law 2. Law 2 is, this means they must acquire this money and steal as much money or disrupt as much as they can the trade of their rival states, while ensuring that there are more exports or goods exiting the country that they are producing than they are importing, which again, importing is our goods coming into the country from other countries. So as you can kind of see, this is the mother country's treasury, the coffers, the treasure chest, and here is the balanced favorable trade where you have more exports than imports. We'll talk a little bit more about this cycle here in the coming slides. According to mercantilism, in order to protect yourself as a state, you had to hoard and stockpile precious metals. Finding New World areas rich in gold and silver were the easiest in their minds, whether it's the Peruvian silver mines or the tales of the golden streets of Coronado. The Spanish searched for these gold and silver masterpieces, and this concept of gold and silver running the show is known as bullionism. Why? A favorable balance of trade, as we said, was necessary to keep a country's supply of gold from flowing into a competing country. They also, in terms of this favorable balance of trade, tried to encourage the manufacturing of certain products to trade. And to accomplish this, governments granted subsidies or monopolies to people. Usually, these served as lucrative favors. This is kind of a middle-age style, like a fief, if you will. You offer a competing or a loyal family to get off your back, or to thank them for your support. You grant them a monopoly and subsidize it with money from the crown. And that their whole notion of this was so that they could efficiently take control of resources and produce lucrative items such as tapestries and glass, etc., and import those to other countries. This, in the end, left out others who had more efficient ideas. And again, stay tuned for the physiocrats of the Enlightenment, which will scoff at this notion. But this is kind of like the modern-day version of when the government gives special grants or subsidies to companies to start stuff or start new companies, like jump-starting a solar power industry. And a lot of times what happens is that these subsidized companies fail, because at the end of the day, they're only in business because of the money that the government gives them. Now, back then, once they subsidized their internal industrial capacity to protect these manufacturers and these new industries, they implemented really, really high protective tariffs against other nations, so internally people wouldn't shop around with other nations. To beef up imports and gain raw materials, they focused on increasing shipbuilding for external trade purposes. And internally, they focused on the construction of roads, bridges, and canals. Possessing colonies was another sexy way for countries to increase their economic power and prestige. Colonies were able to provide the mother country with raw materials and raw materials to the government that supported those monopolized manufacturers, so they could provide unique products to their people and to the products lucrative products to other European countries who they hoped would import their goods. Additionally, those colonies would be more dependent on the mother country, and in other words, they could trade raw materials for finished products made by the mother country. In other words, so let me give you an example. The colonies of the Americas would provide the mother country of England with lumber from our vast woods, and in the end, England would sell us back the final product, which was, let's just say, furniture or finished lumber for building. So that's just a brief example. However, again, making sure that those colonies weren't shopping around, they didn't want your colonies from shopping around, so they passed restricted trade negotiations or trade treaties like England did with the Navigation Acts, which that kind of spawns the American Revolution. We weren't supposed to be trading with Spain. We weren't supposed to be trading with France, but yet we kind of did through the West Indies because we could get goods cheaper. Nonetheless, the goal of mercantilism, you need to know this, is to be totally self-sufficient. If possible, you wanted your country to export more than it had to import, also known as what we've already called a favorable trade balance. It's the complete opposite of laissez-faire and free trade. Christianity will also serve as a stimulus for exploration as governments and religious authorities sought to spread the faith and counter Islam, and as justification for the physical and cultural subjugation of indigenous civilizations. So again, it's what people are looking to do, especially the Catholic nations are looking to replace the subjects, or I should say, replace the people that they lost in their churches thanks to the Protestant Reformation. So we've already mentioned the 3 G's, God, glory, gold. There's this crusading mentality that, whether it's, the 30 Years' War in a case in 1492 or before the 30 Years' War, but the crusading mentality that goes all the way back to, the Crusades, but it was alive and well in the Iberian Peninsula. In fact, Portugal and Spain had been driving out the Moors, the Muslim Moors, since the Middle Ages, which will actually come to fruition. The Reconquista will end in 1492, the same year that Columbus sails the ocean blue. Prince Henry, the navigator of Portugal, was motivated by a great desire to make an increase in the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ and bring him all the souls that should be saved. And this is him. That's a quote from him. Many scholars believe that God was secondary to gold and glory for the economic motivations, but yet it's still significant to realize that in the context of this time period, it's really important to understand how truly religious people were in the 15th and 16th centuries. You look at the wars of religions that we have covered, secular and spiritual matters were rarely separate issues. In fact, I mentioned Prester John. Apparently there was a mythical Christian king somewhere in Africa, and that was one of the fundamental things what Henry the Navigator wanted to do. That's why a lot of early Portuguese explorers are looking for entrance and passage internally into Africa, because if you could link up with a mighty Christian king in Africa at the base of the Moors, you could probably drive a severe blow into the dominance of people of the Muslim faith. And Cortez, famous conquistador, asked Spanish rulers about their duty to make certain Native Americans were introduced into and instructed in the Holy Catholic faith. And he predicted that if the devotion, trust, and hope which they have now in their idols turned so as to repose with the divine power of the true God, they would only work many miracles. So very religious in nature. Okay, lastly too, with Christianity serving as a stimulus, a lot of times following the conquistadors would be the Jesuits. The Jesuits, Franciscan, the Dominican monks who would go in as missionaries and preach the word, and also in some cases force these people to accept their Lord and Jesus Christ as their Savior, and therefore we get into some mistreatment of the natives. Stay tuned, we'll cover that in the next Sigcast. Thanks for tuning in. The end.